So the church, if you had to come up with a visual aid to describe the church, I wonder what you'd choose. Well, Paul gives us an image in 1 Corinthians. He talks about how the church is like a body made up of many different parts, all of them with different functions, held together by Jesus Christ, united by him so that they can perform all that's required. He's the one that gives order and structure to those different parts of the body. But if you read 1 Corinthians, the reality is a bit more like this. It's a mess of arguments and rivalry, of division, of confusion, of complicated questions. Well, that was back then in the first century, but perhaps some things don't change. I'm trying to find the end of this ball of wool. Presumably, there are two ends to the ball of wool. I'll keep searching as I talk. Well, Corinth was a church that Paul knew. Unlike Romans, which is a church he knows about but hasn't yet visited, Paul started the church in Corinth. He'd been there probably around 51, 52 AD and stayed there for about 18 months before heading off to various places before he settled in Ephesus. And it's from Ephesus that he writes the letter. He's heard news from Corinth, from this group of believers, which he helped to start, probably through a letter, and it's accompanied with a collection and maybe a couple of individuals who brought the letter and the money from the collection to him in Ephesus. And he's responding to some of the things they raise, some of the questions they ask, and also some of the situations he hears described in that letter, and maybe even from the people who brought the letter and the money. And not all of it is great, to be honest. Corinth had been refounded by Julius Caesar. It was a port, so it was a place full of people coming and going, people from all over the empire making their home there or passing through. And there was all kinds of agendas, therefore, all kinds of difference there in that place as people try to work out how to exist in that kind of transient community. And we see evidence of that in the letter to the Corinthians as people try to work out how to live alongside people who are different to them, people who worship other gods, as well as people who believe in Jesus and yet have different backgrounds. How are they to be built together into that body when they have such different ideas? It's a place that revolves around trade, and surely a strong economy is the way forward. It's Super Saturday. Get the pubs open, and everything will be okay. Well, there was lots of ideas like that in Corinth, but Paul is really clear. No, it's not about strength. It's not about wisdom. Quite the opposite. In the world's eyes, all that we're about is weakness and folly. But guys, it's real and it's true. And it has to be rooted and grounded in love. As you build a church, as you live together as the people of God in Corinth, you've got to define yourself and root yourself and live according to love. Not according to economic success or the strength of your reputation or the security of your own family. No, it's got to be about how you love one another. I mean, that reminds us of the words of Jesus straight away, doesn't it? But really, Paul, in a cosmopolitan place like Corinth, with all of this other stuff going on around us, all of these cultural challenges and all of these different currents, really, love? You think that's sufficient? Well, yes, says Paul, and he grounds it in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you need to know where true security lies, look there. If it wasn't for the resurrection of Christ, you're right, everything would be in vain. But because of the resurrection of Christ, we can be confident that all of God's promises are yes. There's real security there. We can be confident in God's way of ordering things because the resurrection shows us that ultimately his ways will win over all things, even sin and death. We can be secure because the resurrection of Christ and therefore our resurrection has been secured. So live out of love. Stand firm, he says again and again, but particularly towards the end of the letter, in those verses I've given in the description in chapter 16. Stand firm, keep alert, be courageous, be strong, but be strong and courageous because you're operating out of love. Let all that you do be done not out of rivalry or insecurity or division, but out of love. Because love is actually the way in which, the place in which all of our loose ends, all of our knots, all of our tangles find a home. And if all of us are committed to love, well, then we're straightened out, we're knitted together into that body. And actually, don't tell her I've nicked it, but as my daughter would show, actually that kind of order brings something beautiful. Out of disorder, if we submit to the ways of God and love Him and love one another, well, then all of our loose ends find a home. And truly, we are knitted into a body that is held together by Christ Himself. And whatever happens to that body, nothing can undermine it or overcome it. Well, the Corinthians were new to all of this kind of stuff. They're baby Christians, and we're going to see tomorrow how their journey continues. Paul's writing to them like this. As we'll see, they're not quite like this, but we'll see more about how Paul urges them to live in this way of love rather than earthly wisdom. And perhaps we need to be schooled again in what it means to live in love, to love God, and as an expression of that love of Him, to love one another. Everything is held together by love, God's love for us, and His call for us to love one another with that same kind of love, so that we might be built together as His people. 1 Corinthians shows us it's complicated, but it also holds out a vision of a way forward, a future which is secure because of Christ's resurrection. So I dare you, love as Christ has loved us.